it is, in the spirit of Bob Marley, that I come to you today from Jamaica with this distinctly American accent, courtesy of my 40 years in the US, to join your conversation about financing Africa's recovery and breaking new ground. To that end, I will A, define the reality and context of Africa's need for infrastructure investment to unleash faster, inclusive, and sustainable growth. And B, offer hope that the African Union will transform the hard-won lessons of your experience with the African Medical Supply Platform into a strategy to exercise greater agency in setting the continent's infrastructure priorities and attracting private investment to finance them. In the depths of the COVID crisis, the African Union's leadership gave hope by developing the African Medical Supply Platform, also known as the AMSP, and using it to secure personal protective equipment when there was seemingly none to be had. Furthermore, the aggregated buying power of the African Union vis-a-vis the AMSP made it a more effective purchaser of vaccines than COVAX. And now, looking beyond COVID, what's next? Infrastructure. Systematically prioritized according to which projects will generate returns that exceed their cost of capital and are best for Africa, and put out for bid at scale to the rest of the world. How much more agency do the countries of the African Union have over their development trajectory if, when it comes to the vital question of which infrastructure projects get serious consideration for foreign financing, the African Union found a way to use the power of the AMSP to go on offense and propose infrastructure priorities at scale, rather than having the member countries' infrastructure priorities set in Washington, Beijing, London, and Brussels. This is the story I will share with you today. As with all stories, we must start at the beginning, but I understand we are short of time, so I will move with some speed. Third world countries have come a long way since the 1970s. Indeed, Marley penned his famous song 20 years before the dramatic turnaround in economic performance that is depicted in the figure behind me, and earned these nations the new name of emerging market and developing economies. The figure plots the average growth rate of real GDP in advanced as well as emerging market and developing economies from 1980 through 2018. The emerging market and developing economies are in blue. The important point about this figure is that emerging markets turned themselves around and increased their average growth rate from 3.5% per year between 1980 and 1994 to 5.5% per year from 1995 to 2018. And because advanced economies did not experience a similar increase in growth, we can conclude safely that emerging markets turned around because of investments in what I will call policy infrastructure. Macroeconomic stability, in the form of low, stable, and predictable inflation, competitive exchange rates, more openness to trade and international financial flows, transparent and evenly applied property rights, a larger role for the market in allocating goods and services, and a smaller but appropriately supportive role for the government in the national economy. Importantly, this turnaround is not just the tale of China and India. The improvement in Africa's growth performance has been even more impressive than that of the two largest emerging market economies. Before 1995, African economies grew at a rate of 1.5% per year. Since 1995, including the years of the global financial crisis and before the onset of COVID, Africa grew at 4.3% per year. Simply put, while emerging market and developing economies as a whole have doubled, effectively, their rate of growth, Africa's has increased nearly threefold. Like much of the rest of the developing world, Africa's increased growth has been a result largely of more trade and embracing trade. Research by Dr. Uriela and her colleagues show that between 2000 and 2019, African countries that liberalized trade grew by 1.1 percentage points faster than they did between 1980 and 1999. My own research shows that for the 26 African countries that liberalized trade in the 1980s and 1990s, the average growth rate of GDP in the 10 years before trade liberalization was 2.7%. In the 10 years after liberalization, the growth rate was 5%. A 2.3 percentage point increase, and 22 of the 26 countries that liberalized trade experienced an increase in growth. Given the benefits of trade liberalization in so many African countries, it is of course troubling the direction in which the world is going. Trade outside of Africa will remain vital to the continent's future growth and prosperity. In the meantime, as the rest of the world tapers on trade, the African Union's ratification of the African Continental Free Trade Area in 2019 looks increasingly pressing. In the words of Dr. Songway, Africa does not need a Marshall Plan to ride out the ongoing coronavirus crisis. It is a more powerful tool in the AFCFTA to accelerate regional economic integration and prepare for uncertain times. As we know, maximizing the power of AFCFTA will also require investment in physical infrastructure, roads, power, and the other items needed to provide the connectivity for robust trade inside the African Union and with the rest of the world. So with that, I want to talk now about physical infrastructure, having discussed the policy infrastructure that Africa put in place to grow faster. As documented in the UN Committee of Experts Issues paper, Financing Africa's Recovery, Breaking New Ground, we know that Africa requires greater investment in physical infrastructure. Given more than a decade of low real interest rates and high stock market valuations in rich countries, a significant reallocation of savings from rich countries to the financing of efficient infrastructure investments in Africa, particularly green infrastructure, that would avoid further commitment to carbon-intensive technologies, could raise both Africa's rate of growth and the rate of return on rich country savings. Motivated by the implications of demographics and urbanization for returns on infrastructure, as well as the need to address climate change, in 2015, the World Bank issued a communique which claimed that by leveraging multilateral resources and moving from billions to trillions of investment in physical infrastructure in Africa and elsewhere, institutional investors in rich countries could, 1, close the infrastructure services gap in poor countries, 2, achieve the sustainable development goals, 3, make money. And I know we're going to talk about this in the next session. But what I want to highlight this morning, at this point, is that there is a shortage of infrastructure and services